Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to The Sounds of Film. And I'm so excited to have on the phone with us right now a true legend. I'm talking about director John Pilger. He's a BAFTA and Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. He's also a writer. He's done so many different films that we've talked about through the years, including some of his most recent ones, Utopia and The Coming War on China. Some other films that we've discussed previously on the program that are major films that everyone should go out and see include The War You Don't See and also The War on Democracy. John, thank you so much for joining us on The Sounds of Film.
You're very welcome.
Well, John, this is really exciting for me because you're a filmmaker who tackles a lot of very difficult subjects. You're known for being very critical of U.S. foreign policy. And these two latest films that you've done, Utopia and The Coming War on China, are really quite remarkable in their content. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that you seem to be someone, correct me if I'm wrong, who has always been critical of power, whether it be governments in the United States or the British government, Australia. What is it that you've always discovered needs to be exposed about power, and you do it in your movies?
I think that's a fair description of my work. It is about analyzing and dissecting and in many ways exposing the imposition of great power on people. I've always felt that the most important strand running through our lives is our struggle and the struggle of people everywhere to make their lives decent and better and to resist this imposition of power. And that's certainly it goes right back to when I first was a war correspondent and a correspondent in many places of upheaval. Much of my work has centered around the imposition of American power, because American power is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. We're at the moment, we're being held hostage to this kind of black farce of the ascendancy of Trump, which is really no different, frankly, from the ascendancy of any president in my lifetime. Only this one is much more of a cartoon figure, and this is much more of a media world that we live in. So that will, I hope that helps to explain why so many of my films are about U.S. power. There's never been a power like the U.S. I think the U.S., for much of my life, has been engaged in a kind of war on the world.
Yeah.
My latest film, The Coming War on China, is about the prospect, and the possibility has become actually more of a prospect, of the U.S. provoking a war with China, a completely unnecessary development in human affairs, utterly unnecessary. It is all about preserving that place of power, the dominance, and it was, I think, the Defense Secretary in the last administration, Ashton Carter, who said that, really, he stated it when he said that we will confront anyone who challenges our dominance, and I think he speaks for that great mass that is very difficult to describe, but is national security complex, whatever one wishes to call it, the power in the U.S. And that is what makes our times now especially dangerous because China has risen as a great economic power, not a military power, although it's rapidly catching up, has to, in its own terms. So, yes, power is the theme.
Well, you touched on a lot of different things. You know, as someone living here in America, one of the things that I'm always kind of struck by, and you kind of address this in your movies, is that most Americans don't even seem to really know much about what their country is up to around the world. In some of your films, you cover a variety of different topics, but you touch on things like the School of the Americas, the Marshall Islands, in your latest film, The Coming War on China, and also interestingly on the fact that we just have military bases all over the globe. I mean, just one after another, and people here, I don't think really even think about it much or even know the scope of all these military bases around the world. And you repeatedly bring this stuff up in your movies, and particularly in this one, it's very interesting the way you show that all these military bases are sort of surrounding China, and that, you know, if you were to live there, you would have this sense that America must be getting ready to invade or do something.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think the most telling parts of the new film are the maps giving information that has been well and truly on the record for a very long time. And it's difficult to know which is the most telling map, but probably near the end of the film, I show the map, the bases, the almost 1,000 bases around the world. Actually, there are 4,000 bases in the United States itself. So we're speaking of up to 5,000 bases,
Wow.
U.S. bases on the planet. Now, my source for this was David Vine's excellent work, Base Nation, which he researched this. But, you know, and if you take China, well, China has been in the news in the last year or so for building airstrips on reefs and reclaiming reefs and rocks and islets in the South China Sea, which is actually, as the name suggests, near China. But these are disputed waters, and they're claimed by about 4 or 5 different countries. They have really nothing to do with the United States, although the United States has declared them, with Hillary Clinton, I think, when she was Secretary of State, declared them of national interest of them. So this tells us something about the media, because this has been the news of China's provocation. But what has been completely left out has been the fact that is the other map. And this other map, if you look at it, shows 400 U.S. bases surrounding China like some great noose. They start in Australia and they go up through the Pacific, Asia, Japan, Korea, across Eurasia, and they encircle China, and they're right on China's doorstep. Now, how it's quite a feat to make a fact like this disappear in a media world, but it's been achieved, because the reaction I've had when showing this film is, my goodness, we didn't know that. That's extraordinary. Are you sure that's correct?
Right.
So it's the so-called hidden history. It's only hidden, and hidden news. It's only hidden because it's deliberately suppressed. And Americans, as you described in your remarks at the beginning, perhaps don't know what their country is up to, because they have the illusion of living in an information society censorship by omission. You just leave it out, and it doesn't happen. As Harold Pinter said in his great speech accepting the Nobel Prize for Literature, the U.S. power around the world, its attack on countries, it didn't happen. It didn't happen even as it was happening. It was of no interest. No one cared. And he mocked it in this wonderful speech that he made.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much it. You know, there are more people now aware of it, I think, than ever before, because we do have this extraordinary thing, the internet. And if you want to, you have the will and you have the imagination, perhaps, you can find out this information. It's not hard. And, you know, if you're prepared to take a few steps beyond just Googling something, the information is there. But then the digital world has also entrapped people in their phones and into a lot of other things. So much as that we seem to be getting news, fragmented news, now more than ever, particularly in the Trump era.
Well, I imagine today there's the risk of, you know, a film like yours being labeled as fake news, if you've been following that whole...
Fake news.
Yeah. I mean, there's the whole thing going on now where they're basically trying to attack alternative news websites, and everything. You know, anything that offers, you know, information. I think in some cases, like information that you're getting out, which is credible, but if they label it fake, then they can kind of just dismiss it. We're kind of jumping all over the place, if you don't mind, but like I mentioned
okay. Well, it's all connected. I was very disappointed that my website was not included.
Yeah.
I thought this was outrageous, and I intend to make complaints about this.
Right.
And of course, the whole thing of fake news is that it's fake. The notion, it's an invention, a construct. Let's call something fake news, and you see the way it's been picked up. Right? Well, we're even talking about it now, but we're talking about it because it itself is fake.
Right.
And so, and the newspapers now, which have no credibility, such as the Washington Post, which you know, owned by Amazon, he puts more money into the CIA than he does into the Washington Post, the owner, and ran this list of some very fine and honourable websites that have formed. There's a wonderful Russian word, samizdat, that, you know, during the Soviet time used to be the underground media.
Right.
And that's what we have. And interestingly, in the United States, there is a flourishing samizdat.
Mm.
It's more than in any other country. It's and honoured some of the best journalists in that I know of. Right now, some of these sites have been called fake news. I mean, this is, you know, I mean, we've given up on Orwell. He you know, it's just it's sort of out Orwelling Orwell now.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting is, you know, you made the film "The War You Don't See," and I mean, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange has been very prominent, obviously, in America's latest presidential election, and it's just so fascinating to see, you know, different people's interpretations and points of view of WikiLeaks. Some people, you know, buy into the mainstream media's vilifying of WikiLeaks, but I think for a huge part of the population, the information that he released about Hillary Clinton was devastating throughout this past election, and it was quite remarkable. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your relationship with him?
Well, I've known Julian for some years now, and I have been a supporter and of his and a friend to him during his persecution, and that's what it is, persecution. And I thought, as an investigative journalist, I thought that the arrival of WikiLeaks was one of the most exciting things. And it was very interesting to watch the so-called mainstream media. I wish it didn't have that term, but it does. The so-called mainstream media react with such hostility to WikiLeaks and to Assange. Because what WikiLeaks was doing was shaming them, was saying, well, you haven't done your job.
Right.
It produced more scoops in a matter of months than some of these lazy, overpaid, self-important media people had done in their entire lifetime, and their organizations are compromised anyway. So it wasn't difficult to work out why there was this hostility to both Assange and WikiLeaks, especially among the so-called liberal media. The liberal media was prepared to use and exploit Assange, like The Guardian and The New York Times. They were prepared to do that, but then they quickly turned on him and on WikiLeaks. Because this was really stripping away all the facades that cover so-called public information, and it was a very exciting thing. So I was, because I know that in my own career, some of the best stories that I've pulled off, scoops perhaps, have almost all of them come from whistleblowers.
Yeah.
The people within systems, and they go through hell, a lot of these people, as we've seen, as you've seen in the United States, particularly in the terrible case of Chelsea Manning.
Yeah.
And Julian Assange himself is a whistleblower. He's a publisher, first of all. He publishes what others leak to WikiLeaks, but that puts him in the position of being a very honourable whistleblower. And of course, the whole notion of whistleblowing is supposed to be protected in the U.S. Constitution, because it is, when that was written, I suppose whoever wrote it, I can't remember who wrote it, recognized that the real currency of free information, I think it was Jefferson who referred to the currency of free information, came from the source itself. So all that's very enlightened, and of course it's all been corrupted, of course, especially by Barack Obama, the famous constitutional lawyer who declared Chelsea Manning guilty before before the trial was over, and so on and so forth. But Julian is an extremely courageous man, personally. He has every justification to fear that once he steps outside the embassy, he will disappear into a black hole. The Swedish case is probably the most murky and most dishonest I can remember, and I've seen most of the documents to do with it. The U.S. case has been building into one of the most massive indictments ever pulled together, and secret, of course. They've had difficulty difficulty trying to work out what to charge him with. First of all, he's not an American, therefore he hasn't really, he's not a disloyal or anything. But they wanted to try and charge him with some World War One espionage act that was used to attack conscientious objectors during the First World War. So it's been difficult. There's been a constitutional difficulty in trying to criminalize Julian Assange because he's not a criminal. So his refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy has been absolutely necessary. It's been very difficult for him, of course, and there are some of us like myself who feel honoured to support somebody like this, as I've supported other, dissidents. Julian is a dissident, and they've been dissidents in many countries. They usually represent the best of us.
Yeah. We're speaking with John Pilger, the award-winning filmmaker. His films, there's too many of them to mention, but two of them are out in theaters or out on DVD and Blu-ray. I'm talking about Utopia, which I want to talk about in a minute, and also The Coming War on China. Talking about the role of exposing things that a lot of people don't know about, I was not expecting, when I sat down to watch The Coming War on China, for there to be this whole major section, which was really amazing, about the past, about the Marshall Islands, about nuclear testing. This is an amazing story. Can you tell our listeners a little bit, just very briefly, about the history that you put in this movie and why you decided to include it in this film about the coming war on China?
Well, the reason why is that the coming war on China beckons the possibility of nuclear war. And I think we've been allowed to forget what nuclear war is, where it came, where the whole notion of it came from, and what it does. So I decided to go back to the beginning of the nuclear age. And, of course, the nuclear age began with the atomic bombing of Japan. But it really got underway in 1946 in the Marshall Islands, which are in the middle of the Pacific, and were then a trust territory of the United States. And something like one Hiroshima bomb was exploded in the Marshall Islands, the equivalent of it, every day for 12 years.
That's amazing, by the way.
Yeah, isn't that something? That's quite... And it was Tony DeBron, the foreign secretary, foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, who said this in a speech. And in fact, it's more than that. The explosive power is greater than that. But that's the kind of damage that was done, you might imagine, was done environmentally and, of course, in human terms, to the Marshall Islands. Now, the other connection with China is that right in the middle of the Marshall Islands is one of the U.S.'s biggest and most secretive bases on the island of Kwajalein, the Ronald Reagan missile test site. This base was built in the 1960s, and as the official archive film says, which I found, it was built to combat the threat from communist China. So it commands the Pacific all the way to Asia to China. It's basically aimed at China. So the Marshall Islands become quite significant in this in the Asia-Pacific region, and the U.S. Declaring and imposing its dominance on this region. Of course, the victims of this are the people of the Marshall Islands,
who you refer to as guinea pigs in the movie.
I'm sorry?
You refer to them as guinea pigs in the movie.
Well, they were. There was a secret program for 4.1, which was developed. Department of Energy, Brookhaven National Laboratories in the U.S. as originally as a program of the study of mice, or study of the effects of nuclear explosion on mice, and developed into a study of the effects of nuclear explosions on human beings. And with that in mind, whole communities were left deliberately in the paths of exploding devices. For example, the people of Rongelap, an atoll 100 miles from Bikini. Bikini was evacuated, although many of its people ended up in other islands which were in the path of the winds, the nuclear winds. Now, Rongelap, in particularly, was saturated with nuclear fallout, particularly from the big 1954 Bravo hydrogen bomb explosion. All sorts of assurances were given to the people that it was okay, it was safe, but actually they were left there for 20-odd years until Greenpeace rescued them and took the whole population off. The Marshall Islands was like a big laboratory. Well, as indeed the Japanese were, but the Japanese, that could be justified with the whole nonsense about ending the war in Japan, and Japan was the enemy and they were bad anyway. But that was also a laboratory. But the Marshall Islands hadn't gone to war against the United States, and so this had to be covered up, and it was covered up for a very long time. And only this secret program was only found by accident. The information about it was only found by accident. So the cancers, particularly thyroid cancers, were widespread. Many people died very young, and the film describes what happened to them, and there are some extraordinary survivors, and they appear in the film. People, mostly women, who were young children when the Bravo bomb was exploded and saw it actually explode, and have survived multiple operations and kept going.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, I think people, when they see this movie, The Coming War on China, are going to be shocked, not only to just find out about all of this, but to really just think about the reality that their government could willingly and secretly do this testing on people. Like, it actually happened, and maybe to people like yourself that have seen a lot of things like this around the world, it won't be so surprising. But for a lot of people, I think that's going to be very upsetting. It should be.
Well, it is very upsetting, but what we've got to lose, it's a bit like losing your virginity.
Right.
We've got to lose this surprise about power.
Yeah. Well, I know we don't have a lot more time. There's so many different topics I want to talk about, but I did want to just ask you before you have to go about your film Utopia. It's not always power exerting control over the rest of the world. And your film, you're Australian. You talk about a very local situation that I think Americans are going to relate to, because here in America, I mean, all throughout the year, there's been news about Black Lives Matters. There's been the pipeline story with Native American Indians, and you just see over and over again the way these different groups are starting to stand up and talk about their mistreatment. And then you have your own story going on in Australia. It's an amazing story that a lot of people don't know about. Can you just tell us about that really quickly before we wrap this up?
Sure. Well, look, it's all connected.
Yeah.
It's not really local. Australia was invaded by a great power
Right.
in the late 18th century. And that great power was Britain, probably then the hyperpower of the world. And colonial societies, settler societies, have a great deal in common. The United States was begun in the same way, with certain different overtones, with religious, persecuted, and so on. But it basically was a colonized society. And one of the first things the colonizers did was to set to work slaughtering the indigenous population. And that's exactly what they did in Australia. Interestingly, in Australia, as the historian Henry Reynolds has revealed, that the rate of rapaciousness, of slaughter, if you like, was greater in Australia than it was in the United States. It's hard to imagine when you look at what was done in the so-called Indian Wars. But so similar forces of colonialism, imperialism were at work in this country. And lies. Australia was declared by the British authorities as terra nullius, empty land. It's like censorship by omission of an early version. You just simply say there's no one there, when in fact there was probably the oldest continuous human presence in Australia. A very, very extraordinary group of Aboriginal people who are really the only distinctive thing about Australia. Otherwise, it's a completely derivative society, colonial society. So similar things happened there, as happened in South Africa, has happened in the United States, has happened in Canada, has happened in New Zealand. What make in all these countries where indigenous people had been the object of this usually Christian-driven imperialism, was that in all those other countries, some form of recognition of the indigenous people as an entity was agreed. In New Zealand, there were the so-called Maori Wars, which ended up with certain treaties. In the United States, there has been progress towards recognition in various forms, though the situation is still dire, as it is in Canada. But in all these countries, which have this very similar history, something happened. In Australia, there is still no recognition. It's still being talked about here, still being debated. It's interesting. Utopia has created a great deal of interest in the United States, and I have to say I've had some of the most thoughtful reviews, particularly in the academic world in the US, where there appears to be an historical understanding of this.
Yeah.
Even in popular culture in the United States, you may remember a movie called Soldier Blue.
Yeah.
and that was back in the early 1970s,
Right.
that actually turned the tables on the cowboys and Indians thing. And in terms of popular culture, there were some really very considerable changes. There's been none of that in this country. That's what makes Australia separate. But going back to the original theme, it is still, all about the imposition of power on people. It's the same thing. Left alone, people will make their own societies and live their lives and get on with each other generally. Not always. They'll fight with each other, yeah. But in a way that, not necessarily in a way that now could menace us all.
Well, John, I want to thank you for speaking with us tonight. The work that you do is so powerful, and I know it's not easy. You're dealing with very controversial topics, and it's not always easy to get funding for films like these. And I don't know how you do it. You just keep at it, and I really admire that, because I don't know if our listeners realize how hard it is what you do. And you've been doing it for a while, and you continue to do it. I don't know what motivates you, but it's impressive. And I'm hoping that we can talk again one day in the future. I want to recommend to all of our listeners to check out the films Utopia. It's out on Icarus Films DVD and Blu-ray, and also look for The Coming War on China. John, thank you again so much for joining us on The Sounds of Film. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
All right, Bye. Good night.